Hey Rob, big fan, says Christian L. Can you talk a little about when your views changed on Israel? Was it one mask off moment or more of a bit by bit thing? It was certainly a bit by bit thing. I was, it's funny. I had a buddy, I guess drinking buddy. Wow. So yeah, this is when I was still drinking. Um, I only really had 10 months, kind of as an adult living by myself, drinking before I quit drinking in 2004. But one of my drinking buddies, when I had drinking buddies, was a Lebanese banker, and we would go down to the Fox and Hound, and we would talk about um, Israel Palestine, and God, if there were recordings of that conversation, I would be embarrassed. It was sub Douglas Murray. It was bloodthirsty. Palestinians aren't civilized nonsense. It's funny, but even back then, I acknowledged, as most Zionists do today, or at least most Zionists in conversations in the United States, that the settlements were an atrocity, that obviously Israel had no real interest in peace if they were engaged in the settlements. But, I grew up in the New York City area, famously, with a ton of Jewish American friends for whom Israel was very, very serious. I remember one of my first interactions was, I had a very punk rock buddy who was Jewish American, and punk rock, we don't care about anything, blah, blah, blah. And I remember when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by Israelis for the Israeli prime minister assassinated by Israelis for being pro peace. And I went over and I was like, oh yeah, isn't that hilarious? Blah 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 blah. And it was surprising to me. It was an education to me. I was a 14-year-old at this point. That my Jewish American buddy was like, no man, what the fuck are you talking about? This is like horrible, horrible thing. And which is just to say that I grew up in the United States. You grow up in an environment, and I sometimes forget that not everybody grows up in the New York City suburbs with most of their friends being Jewish. That wasn't the case for people that I met at the University of Michigan. There are, of course, Jewish people in the Detroit suburbs, but it's not quite New York City suburbs. The and folks that I've talked to in the South who just didn't really have that experience at all. But in the United States more broadly, we have this baseline of just sort of Zionism, pro-Israel thought that we all get. And I had a more strong personalized version of that growing up in the New York City suburbs. So I was pretty well armored when I went to Istanbul. I'd certainly gotten to the point by 2011 when I moved to Istanbul that I acknowledged that the Iraq War was a terrible mistake, that Afghanistan and Iraq were fundamentally bloodthirsty things that we had done. I was becoming, as I was becoming more and more hostile to U.S. foreign policy, I was a lot less willing to listen to a lot of Israeli arguments about why what they were doing to the Palestinians was justified. But broadly, it was sort of, why should I shift my view on this issue that is so deeply seated? So I would say that my sort of Zionism long outlasted my post 9/11 bloodthirsty kill all the Arabs phase. And I'd been really well armored actually by my upbringing. As I'd fallen further and further from sort of National Review and other conservative outlets, I'd recognized that a lot of things they'd said were nonsense, but I'd convinced myself that Europe and European politicians, specifically because they were less willing to co-sign Israel's violence, that they were anti-Semitic. Europeans are just anti-Semitic. Americans are the only true friends of Jewish people. I'd completely internalized this, and obviously I knew going into Turkey that most Turks were going to hate Israel because they're Muslims, and that makes sense, frankly. But I was well armed for that, and I was I can't say that I mean, even into, frankly, up until October 7th, in my hundreds of videos at this point on the Middle East, I'd done 2 on Israel Palestine, essentially to say, leave me alone, I don't want to talk about this. And that was sort of the way that I approached things when I was living in Turkey. And I was able to just sort of brush off if my British friends said something about, brought up something horrible that Israel had done, or if my Turkish friends, I just sort of like, okay, cool, whatever, like just sort of smile and nod and like, these fucking anti-Semites don't know what they're talking about. What really got it, what really did the trick, what really solidified with it was an evening I spent at Cafe La Viola, which was my favorite bar in Istanbul. Not that anybody else liked this bar. Why I like this bar is because I am a nicotine fiend. And I was really into nargileh. I was really into hookah smoking. And Cafe La Viola, it was illegal, I think, to sell both hookah and alcohol at a place. I was sober back then, but if people were going to sit there with me while while I smoked a hookah for hours, they had to be drinking. So I really loved Cafe La Viola. And I spent I think I was there with an Irish guy and two Jewish guys from the United States, two Jewish American guys, one Jewish Canadian guy. And we sat there for about 4 hours, and they just described to me their experience. This was sort of the moment, and I think I'm simplifying it a little bit. I did have an evening with at least two of those guys just sitting there, like as they described their experience. But I also had in Istanbul a lot of Jewish friends from North America who had a similar story. And what happened this evening at Cafe La Viola, over hours as I smoked this nargileh, in fairly moving terms, these guys described growing up Jewish in the United States and the way that Israel had always been sold to them, and how they bought it and were really dead. I think one of them became got his undergrad and a master's degree in Jewish history, like very, very just into this identity and whatnot, and how both of them, and now I'm thinking of four guys, not all four of them were sitting there, went to Israel in pursuit of this idea, and all of them were incredibly disillusioned by what they saw there. A similar experience to what Ta-Nehisi Coates described recently in his book, just like, what is this? This is horrible. Most of them went on to live in the occupied West Bank, which sort of puts the lie to this idea that you can't be Jewish and live in Palestine. Actually, I do have a friend who, this is before George Bush put Hamas in charge of Gaza, but he lived in Gaza as a Jewish guy, not in a settlement. And there are plenty of Jewish people who live in, anyway, I don't know, maybe it's Jewish folks from the United States who, folks in the West Bank consciously want to butter up, for sure. That's just good politics. But anyway, friends of mine, good friends of mine, were Jewish guys who had grown up in the United States or Canada, gone to Israel, been so appalled that they essentially became like full-on Free Palestine guys. And that's the moment. I think it's the influence of those men and women that really, that actually I think it's mostly dudes now that I'm thinking about it. But yeah, it was the influence of those guys that broke my Zionism. And that's why the sort of pro-Israel establishment in the United States is so terrified of and so angry at young Jewish people who are raised on Israel, and then go there, see it for themselves, and recoil in horror. So that was, that was the moment. I don't know. So that was probably at some point, I don't know, 2013, 2014, just sitting there, and that sort of is the moment that my what was left of my Zionism. I mean, I'm still, you asked a lot of people, I'm still a Zionist. Like, I'm still pro the continued existence of the state of Israel. I'm not entirely certain that one-state solution is the right idea. I think I might still be one of the last two-state solution guys. I honestly, the fact that I can be pro-Israel and also at the same time be pretty convinced like pro the existence of Israel and also be pretty convinced that they're going to complete this genocide makes me, I guess, still kind of a Zionist. I guess, yeah, which is pretty dark. But the sort of standard American like. Israel's great, and the Palestinians are subhumans. I don't need to think about. That was ended for me in a Istanbul nargile cafe / bar called Cafe La Viola in the early 20 teens.